mystery that I think most of you would be somewhat familiar with. Every year, there we go, trillions of dollars are invested in innovation initiatives around the world. And as you know, every year, 70 to 90% of them fail. And the mystery is, why? We have private spaceflight. We have computers in every pocket and on many wrists. And yet, we cannot predict with any reliability, any consistency, whether or not people will accept or deny a new fact, let alone whether or not they will adopt or resist a new technology. Now, quick show of hands. How many of you have seriously considered why people would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a handbag, right? One of my personal favorites, this innovation in clothing. Pants literally designed to fall off while you wear them. This was hugely successful, right? There are still people walking around with their pants falling off, right? Closer to home, the medical fraternity. Strangely resistant to new science, right? Took them 10 years to accept that peptic ulcers were caused by bacteria that could be treated with antibiotics. Today there's a similar situation going on with type 2 diabetes. We know that the mechanism that is currently taught in medical schools is not in fact the mechanism that produces type 2 diabetes. And yet it still attracts tens of millions of dollars in research, right? Our community. We have studied resistance to technology for decades, right? Ben Franklin, big fan of Ben, took note of this irrational response to facts 250 years ago. So at least in part, the answer to this mystery is in understanding and explaining why we make irrational choices, right? We're clearly capable of reasoning. Why is it, what influences our choices that produces such irrational outcomes? Now, solving this mystery is incredibly important, right? There's the trillions of dollars that we spoke about. As a practitioner, which is my background, I need to know. My livelihood depends on this answer, right? But the real importance is think about how incredible it would be for humanity if we had a 70 to 90% success rate instead of failure rate. This would be massive. So what do we know? We know that 100% of innovation initiatives share one decision point, right at the beginning. Someone makes a decision to select them, to act on them, to invest in them. We know that 100% of successful innovation initiatives share a second decision point. The market, individuals in the market make decisions, they make choices to adopt and use what we've produced. We also know that after being fiercely defended for centuries, rational choice theory is now accepted, has decisive limitations. We also know that there's no consensus about an alternative. There are literally hundreds of theories of motivation and decision and behavior and choice to consider. Now, at least two of these have a difference. They look at behavioral responses, behavioral research, but they're also grounded in the physical. Now, one of these, basic psychological needs, there are 4 proposed basic psychological needs. Those are all a subset of evolved psychological mechanisms, the other. So we focused on evolved psychological mechanisms and asked which are relevant to these 2 decision points. For which do we have both this behavioral research and this physical research, but also evidence that they have a generalized impact on decision making, not specialized, so that they might be relevant here. And then last, can we take this theory of evolved psychological mechanisms and come up with a pragmatically useful tool, something that will inform practice? To answer those questions, we came up with the consilience by semantic field method. Now, this method starts with the application of semantic field analysis effectively across the entirety of the Web of Science database, where what we're doing is looking for uniquely studied, uniquely labeled behavioral phenomena that could be reasonably attributed to a common evolved psychological mechanism. So, for example, in economics, Veblen goods, conspicuous consumption, widely studied. This is when we spend ridiculous amounts of money just to show off our status. In biology, When you look at animals, that's just called posturing or social dominance signaling. Study radically different fields, basically the same behavior. Now, after applying semantic field analysis across this disparate body of research, we then used bibliometric analysis, right? This would be highly suspect to bias and different epistemological and ontological differences. So we applied bibliometric analysis to identify shared concepts, shared supporting research, and shared references, obviously, that interlinked in an impartial way all of this research that we found. We then examined this now substantial, interconnected, but impartially interconnected web of research to see if we could develop a nomological network of evidence to confirm our evolved psychological mechanism. Now, as discussed, nomological networks of evidence look at physical research, things like hormone responses, genetics, fMRI studies, right? With behavioral research, so from psychology, but also from sociology, anthropology, archaeology, economics, pretty much you name it, political science. What that allowed us to do is establish with certainty that an EPM was the explanation for these shared common behaviors. Having established our EPMs, compared those EPMs or examined those EPMs to see if they explained the existing variables and moderators within the current adoption and resistance literature. If they did offer a robust explanation for those variables and moderators, we would have further evidence in support of our EPM. If they didn't, then we could refute that EPM and certainly rule it out as a contributor or an influence on our decision points. Our results. We're happy to report that the consilience by semantic field method was very effective. It allowed us to identify evolved psychological mechanisms. It also allowed us to very efficiently determine if a nomological network of evidence could be produced to support those EPMs. We'd also like to, or happy to propose that evolutionary choice theory as an inclusive alternative to rational choice theory. Evolutionary choice theory is simply defined as the collective impact of these identified evolved psychological mechanisms.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, excellent. I'll speed up. It's supported by a nomological network of evidence of its own. It passes Eugene Fama's 4-part test for adopting a new theory over an old. Critically, it offers a robust explanation and fills the current gap for a robust explanation for all of the existing moderators and variables in the adoption and resistance literature. And from my perspective, it's a very pragmatic tool. What we can do is look at core of all psychological mechanisms, namely our need to belong to groups and our fear of ostracism or exclusion, our need for relative status and our desire to avoid or resist the loss of status, our fear of challenging others, our innate reluctance to challenge others unless we are certain we're going to win, or unless we fear we're going to lose belonging and status as a result. We have a drive for novelty. Literally, our health will decline if we don't get a certain drive for novelty or a certain amount of novelty in our lives. And last, a compulsion to rationalize. We regularly don't reason through answers. This evolved psychological mechanism is actually triggered after we make the decision, when we rationalize why we made it. Now, we can apply that to our selection of innovation opportunities, to how we choose to present them, and how we choose to develop them, so that we can look at a value profile. Rather than just looking at economic utility, which is generally 0 or positive, if we look at each of these EPMs as a unique form of value, which they are, they're processed by unique systems in the brain. So we don't have a rational decision system from which we're biased away. We actually have unique decision-making processes. So we can apply this concept of a value profile and develop products that don't just have positive economic utility, but that, importantly, don't have negative values for belonging and status, because that's what triggers the resistance. I'm out of time, but I hope that is applicable, and would say it's applicable to the organization as a whole. Thank you for your time.